Hey guys, welcome back. We are going to talk about, we're going to continue our discussion on the lower body. So, coming off of a couple of activity days, this is going to kind of help recap on some of our more important bullets and also to just let me sprinkle in some extra information. So, uh, I'm anticipating a pretty short one today. So, between our complex versus simple exercise lecture and what we talked about in our upper body days and both in the weight room and in lecture and coming off of our lower body activity days, today should be pretty short. So we're going to kind of zip through it here, predicting like 20 or 25 minutes. So it depends how many random tangents and rabbit holes I end up going down, but I'm predicting a pretty short one. So let's recap on some of these exercises. I'm not going to talk my way through every single one of these, but I'm going to go through them fairly thoroughly. Sloppy core, that's involved in basically all of these exercises where we're loading that spine. It's just always a risk hazard. And again, lower back pain is the number one reason that people go to the doctor in the United States. So maybe not so much of a problem for our younger athletes, but as we get into our general population and older crowd, it's going to get more and more frequent. So just keep that in mind. One of, if not the most important thing we can keep an eye on during training. On that front squat, watching the elbows drop, pulling athletes out of position. Why does this happen? Is it because their wrists aren't mobile enough? That's pretty rare. Yeah, it happens, but most of the time it's because that the lats are tight and it's not allowing for a simple elbow drive to put that bar in the correct position. What should be sitting on that deltoid there and kind of in your throat. So you kind of talk like Kermit the Frog a little bit, but that's all right. It's going to be sitting on your deltoids in your front of your throat just a little bit. Just make sure it's not so intense that you're passing out. That's always freaky to see in the weight room. It happens every once in a while. They always stand back up from what I've seen, but yeah, just watch out for that. And then with any of our loading, we always want to watch out for valgus knees. That's when that knee drives inwards. And if their knees are going valgus during an exercise that is slow and controlled in the weight room, it's probably going to happen out on the basketball court as well. So imagine a basketball player jumping up multiple times fighting for a rebound. Well, each time they're coming down and going valgus, each time becoming more and more likely to pop an ACL. So something we really want to watch out for. And if we can train it and avoid that valgus position in the weight room, that's probably going to carry over onto the sport competition field as well. Back squat, more core stability, importance of that, but watch out for those poor setups. So especially when we can't see that bar behind us, we want to make sure that we are balanced and in a central position, that our spine is lined up with the center of the barbell to the best of our abilities. So watch out, watch your teammates back and have them watch yours, and coach your athletes up. Watch out for that. Teach your athletes how to spot each other to make sure that that's one of the top priorities, is actually just getting centered under the bar. And then as far as more poor steps, a lot of athletes will get that bar on their back and they come out of the rack and they're in such a hurry to start squatting, is that they don't have the same stance as normal, and their stance is maybe more wide, more narrow, or it's offset and they're doing like a bunch of funky like twisting throughout the motion. So just coach them up on being consistent. And obviously you have to take it one rep at a time, but that's just the math and the physics of it. But talk about the psychology of taking it one rep at a time. Is getting set, stabilizing, maybe a breath in, in and out of the rep, breath out. Did the rep go well? Are you ready for the next one? And just separating the reps mentally, just to give a little bit more focus and building up the consistency of the lifting. And then short range motion on the back squat. A lot of lifters will feel like they are bottoming out, and they won't even be at parallel with their femur. So this is something that you need to set your standards and know why you're coaching what you're coaching. For me on the back squat, I like to get my athletes below parallel because I'm going to get more hamstring activation out of that. And that's going to apply a little bit better to the sport and competition field. It's also going to help build a little bit more muscle mass. So for me, that's kind of what I like. but I don't always go that way. And if I have an athlete who's really struggling on it, and I'm suspecting maybe some injury or some major mobility issues, in my younger years of coaching, that's something where I would just basically yell at them to go, maybe not yell at them, but encourage them. And my coaching cue that I would yell to them would be to go lower, lower. I don't know how many athletes I told to just tell them to go lower over and over and over again. But now I may start with that, but quickly move on to, hey, how was that feeling? What's going on here? Hey, do you have any ankle injury history? What's happening down there? How's your back? And then kind of working my way through that. And maybe we reassess and we set the standard for that athlete to squat higher because of a rationale, or maybe we move them over to a different variation of the lift, such as a goblet squat, a front squat, or a unilateral squat. And then that split squat, a lot of lifters will get up on their toe box on the front foot and make it quad dominant. For me, a lot of times I like to get a little bit more glute and hamstring activation out of this lift. And so I will coach them to have a heavy heel out front to put their weight on their heel. We always want to watch out for the core. And with their short range of motion, probably the number one thing is that the stance is too short. So they're standing, just their feet are too close together. So not so much the width. The width should be about hip width, but you just want that stance to be nice and long. So you have room to sink into your rep. And then you want to drive off that front heel to be your big driver to get you back up. How about our lower body pulls? Again, kind of zipping through this. I think we can get you guys out of here today pretty quickly based on how much we've kind of touched on this stuff already. With the deadlifts, you're going to want to protect that back and the core as best you can. Coach up that core big time. Watch for athletes who maybe have a little bit of anxiety going into the rep. What they'll do is they'll get into a really good position to get tight, and then they'll drop down and try to use their body momentum to rip the bar up off the ground. It basically never works, especially if there's a respectable load on the bar, and all it does is really throw the lifter out of position. So think about getting tight first, butt down, big chest, tight back, long, straight arms. And remember on our lower body pull day, I tried to hold the microphone down so you guys could kind of hear that bar kind of going clink into the center of the plate. How there's just a little bit of room in that plate. And what you can do is you can pull that bar tight first. You can take the slack out of the bar is one way of describing it. But you can get that bar tight first. You can get your body tight first. And then all you're trying to do is really push your hips forward and hang on to the bar. So you're pulling the bar up, but you're really pulling it back. And it can also just be sort of a glute bridge, a standing glute bridge almost. And then hips hiking. So if you're ever watching a lifter from the side and you see them begin the lift and their hips jump up first, well, the reason that tends to happen, it could be a technique thing, but the reason that tends to happen is that the core is weak and the lifter is subconsciously trying to work around their core. But what happens is that butt jumps up and then the lifter still has to, they end up using more of the core than they would if they just maintain a good posture in the first place. So the hips will jump up and then the lifter basically has to do an RDL from the bottom up. Let's see, for our Romanian deadlift, that bar drift. So think about a lifter who's standing at the top. When they're at the top and they're holding the bar at the top, that bar is probably sitting against their thighs. That bar should stay against the leg throughout the range of motion. So as the hips hinge backwards, that bar should not drift away from the legs forwards. The reason it does is that sometimes lifters are not actually hinging backwards with their hips. They're actually just bending over. And so that bar will tend to drift forward. So it's a good indicator that the hips aren't doing the right thing, but it's also just a common mistake. So we want our butt to go that way and the bar to basically travel in a straight line. And in most movements, we're going to have a short range of motion, but a common error in the Romania deadlift is a long range of motion. So a lot of lifters will think about touching the plates down to the floor, or maybe they'll stand up on a box and try to go even further. But for most lifters, if they're tight through the upper back and they're actually hinging their hips backwards, all you really want to do is find a stretch in your hamstrings to about a level 7 out of 10, and then stand back up. You want to stretch your hamstrings and then squeeze your glutes to drive your hips forward, and that's your RDL. A lot of people they'll start rounding their spine. They will intentionally go further than they really need to. It's about feel. You want to feel it, not necessarily take it down to the floor. So long range motion is kind of a unique problem there. With good mornings, the core is important. Having low hip action, so instead of hinging the hips back, a lot of people will just sort of bend forward, and this is tremendously stressful on the lower back, and also not very athletic. It's not getting your hips in the game quite the way you want it to. And the good morning is one where the short range of motion is really prevalent. And aside from teaching technique, a lot of times we just have to lighten the load. It's a very humbling movement, with the lower back often being the weakest link. When we isolate that weak link, a lot of times we actually don't need very much weight at all to get the job done. A powerlifter by the name of Bill Starr wrote an article called Deadlift Less to Deadlift More. So just something I want you all thinking about. So just to touch on that again, is that with our deadlifts, that lower back does not have a lot of muscle mass around it. It has a lot of muscles that are near there, and a lot of connective tissue, but it's not very thick with muscles. So when stress travels through that, it's not affecting the body in a way that it does normally in maybe your glutes or your quads, where the muscles are thick and you can see them. Because if you think about even a 300-pound professional bodybuilder, when they pop their shirt off and they turn around, they've got all those big muscles in the lats, and then their butt might be big, but in between those, they have a pretty small lower back. There's not a whole lot of muscle in there. So when we try to treat it like a lot of other movements, like the deadlift, if we try to treat the deadlift like a lot of other movements, it's common that we end up overtraining or just overstressing that lower back. So one chunk of advice from Bill Starr is to basically deadlift less often. And so we can still keep the deadlift in frequently, but we kind of hold it to a different standard. We give up a little bit of intensity, and we focus a little bit more on form, or we can keep a similar intensity, but we're going to reduce our frequency. And then, like we talked about on our activity day in the weight room, on our pull day, is that you can still do a lot of deadlifts, but you may just not always do floor deadlifts. You may do some rack pulls, or just mix it up with different levels of the deadlift. So getting all the way down to the floor can be additionally stressful on that lower back because you're in such that flexed position. Yeah, using Prilepin's chart. So again, on our conventional deadlift, we could use this. The chart is based off of a group of weightlifters. And so for these complex and compound full body movements and lower body movements, it's very appropriate for the squat and pretty appropriate for the deadlift. If you look into like the Romanian deadlift, it's going to be a little bit more appropriate for that. Good mornings, it's going to be appropriate for that, but that deadlift is just stressful and often causes quite a bit of damage. I don't mean to badmouth the deadlift. I love that movement. It's a lot of fun. It's a great challenge. It has a lot of good benefits, but it is one stressful son of a gun. Okay, so we know that lower back pain is the #2 reason that Americans go to the doctor, besides behind the common cold. If we can prevent lower back pain or improve lower back pain or cure lower back pain for individuals, we're probably going to be a friend of theirs or somebody that they give money to. So this is important, and kind of learning about lower cross syndrome is going to be a great tool to have in your tool chest. So this is something I turn to on a regular basis for my own self-care, but it's also something that it's basically the first place I go when I have an athlete with lower back pain. And what it is that these 4 sectors of muscles are out of whack, and this causes our pelvis to tilt. So I've got that bowl of Cheerios and bananas there that looks pretty dang good. And I want you guys to kind of think about that. That bowl is that our pelvis should kind of look like a bowl. In that, let's see how my drawing is here. All right, our pelvis should look like a bowl that is kind of like neutral. That's a so-so drawing. But when our hip flexors get tight, as they often do, so let's say we're sitting down quite a bit, maybe we're doing a lot of driving, or we've got some papers that are due and we are sitting at the computer doing a lot of extra typing, and we're leaning forward and our posture stinks, well then our hip flexors will tighten up. And when our hip flexors tighten up and we stand up or we get out of the car after like a 12-hour day of driving, we get out of the car, what's happened is our hip flexors might have shortened, and it will pull your pelvis down in the front. And because your pelvis is like a bowl, when your pelvis comes down on one side, it just tips up on the other side. So when the pelvis is down in front here, on the back side, it's higher. And as that pelvis drives up into the lower back, it's very natural to get additional lower back pain because you have basically an imbalance. You have too much material in one spot. So that's why that lower back pain is a presentation there. That there's may actually nothing terrible going on in the lower back, but it's sort of a orchestra of bad things happening in these four areas. So the lumbar erectors are tight and maybe overactive. The hip flexors are tight and overactive. And then your abs become weak and elongated, and your glutes become weak and elongated. So what do you want to do? You want to give the lower back and the hip flexors some TLC, some tender loving care. You want to stretch them out, maybe get some massages, do some static stretching to help elongate them. And then what do you want to do with your weak abs and your weak glutes? You want to smash them. You want to train them up. You want to get them stronger, get them bigger, and get them activated. And when we're doing all this, it will actually help that pelvis return back to a neutral position. Because nobody wants to spill their honey, their Honey Nut Cheerios and their bananas, right? So if you guys can just basically memorize this, I can't tell you how many times I've drawn up a similar little diagram like this up on the board to athletes and clients. And we talk about why it's important to stretch their hip flexors, why it's important to train their glutes, and why they need to take care of their lower back. Because of this pattern, this theory, this phenomenon, whatever it is, because of this syndrome, I guess that's what it is. Because of this, a lot of times what happens in the hamstrings is the hamstrings, when that pelvis tips up in the back, those hamstrings are elongated and drawn up with the pelvis. And so they feel very tight. And so individuals will stretch their hamstrings. That actually makes it conducive for that pelvis to tip even more. And then, there's some temporary relief with that hamstring stretching, but then the hamstrings will feel the same or worse. And that's because the pelvis is actually has an opportunity to get in an even worse position. So a lot of times when the hamstrings are really tight, a lot of times what you actually want to do is go out and stretch your hip flexors on the front side. And so I kind of inserted this into our lower body discussion because I need you guys to know a little bit more about lower back pain and how to address it, and actually how your training may be conducive to nurturing this lower cross syndrome. So if we are constantly smashing the quads and the lower back, we are nurturing lower cross syndrome. If we're getting in a sufficient amount of ab work and glute work and posterior chain, we're going to help counteract the tightening that is occurring in the quads and the lower back. And also I wanted to go on a spiel about those hamstrings because I think that is a really common problem that a lot of us could just do better on, is not stretching hamstrings for the wrong reasons. Okay, so remember our Goldman dilemma? It basically says that athletes, some athletes are willing to die for success. And I kind of want to bring that up is because, all the athletes and clients I work with, they all want their goals, but they don't want to necessarily die trying, and not many of them want to get hurt in that pursuit. So if we're going to be exercise scientists, if we're going to methodically help them achieve their goals, what you have to remember is that you and I might know and believe that, oh, hey, if you get your squat a little bit heavier or your deadlift a little bit heavier, that's going to make you stronger in, these muscle groups. And then you're going to be able to run faster, and your sprint time out on the track is going to improve, and you're a sprinter. So that's a great thing. Well, you and I know how to connect the dots, and we know that getting strong in the weight room can help produce some additional speed or power or whatever we want to say. But if we can't explain that to the athlete, we're not getting the buy-in, and we want that buy-in. And if we end up hurting the individual doing something that they didn't necessarily need to do, then we definitely did not keep the goal. So I just wanted to take a second to remind everyone to keep the goal. And I think I got all my ranting in for now. And I'll just leave you with this. Godzilla is bad, and Quadzilla is good. All right, guys, see you next time.